Ok, vamos dar início. Técnicos, mas é um grande prazer estar aqui com vocês para essa conversa sobre educação bilíngue, multilíngue e interculturalidade. Muito obrigada a vocês, mais uma vez. E então vamos lá para a nossa discussão. Nós vamos conversar um pouquinho com as nossas convidadas em inglês, e vocês que nos acompanham, fiquem à vontade para enviar as perguntas em português, em inglês, né, na língua da sua preferência. Okay, so we're going to begin now. First, let's go to the introductions. Antonieta Megale holds a master's in applied linguistics from PUC São Paulo and a doctorate in applied linguistics from Unicamp. She coordinates postgraduate studies and extension courses in bilingual education at Instituto Singularidades and is a collaborating professor of bilingual education in a number of universities in Brazil. She's also a consultant and a speaker in the area of bilingual education. Thank you for joining us, Antonieta. And Fernanda, we have to edit the resume, right? Her resume, but she's a researcher and professor at PUC São Paulo. She holds a degree in languages from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, a master's and a doctorate degree in applied linguistics from PUC São Paulo. Fernanda leads the LACE, Linguagem em Atividade no Contexto Escolar, and GEB, Grupo de Estudos em Educação Bilíngue, research groups. And she is also one of the co-founders of the Global Play Brigade. Thank you so much for joining us, Fernanda. And Ofelia García, dispensando apresentações, não é? But Ofelia is a professor emerita in the PhD programs of urban education and of Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She has been professor of bilingual education at Columbia University's Teacher College, dean of the School of Education at the Brooklyn campus of Long Island University, and professor of education at the City College of New York. All of us who study bilingual and work with bilingual education have read many of Ofelia's publications, and we thank you so much for joining us. So, to begin our discussion, we're going to, I think, begin with Antonieta and start setting the tone here. Antonieta, I would like to ask you, how would you describe the Brazilian bilingual education scenario? Let's create this context for our discussion.
Hello, Susan. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you all. And I'm very happy that everything works, and let's do it. So I thank you for the question, Susan. I think it's a very important question, and any guideline or discussion about bilingual education should start by acknowledging our very diverse linguistic scenario. As you may know, Brazil is one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world. In our last census, 274 indigenous languages were identified, and around 50 languages related to immigration were mapped. However, throughout our history, we have systematically attempted to eradicate our linguistic diversity or make it invisible. So I will briefly explain 3 linguistic policies that have contributed to the narrative about Brazil being a monolingual country. So the first one, from 1758, was when Marquês de Pombal decreed that all indigenous languages had to be replaced by Portuguese in all public domains. The second one was adopted during the Second World War, more precisely in 1942, by our president, Getúlio Vargas, when he proclaimed that the national languages from enemy countries, German, Japanese, and Italian, that were used in immigrant communities were forbidden in schools and everywhere else in society. And the third one was related to the deaf community. They were allowed to use only Portuguese at school because it was believed that the use of sign languages would hinder the development of Portuguese. So all these policies reinforced the status of Portuguese as the only language of Brazil. And they also had a lasting legacy and altered the landscape of social-linguistic diversity in Brazil. And they obviously affected the individual and collective identities of minority language speakers and the way they were represented in the society. But with the introduction of a new constitution in 1988, major official changes in the way Brazil dealt with its languages began to occur. So in this document, indigenous languages and culture were finally acknowledged, and it encouraged the development of bilingual programs and language revitalization programs in indigenous communities. And also the demand for bilingual education programs for deaf people emerged alongside an already existing movement in favor of Brazil Sign Language. This movement succeeded in getting approval for new laws, including the acknowledgement of Libras as a Brazilian language and its inclusion as part of the syllabus of university teacher education courses. In the same spirit, although they were not backed up by the Constitution, bilingual education programs have also been established in several immigrant communities, mainly due to the movement of language co-officialization that established that around 20 Brazilian cities are bilingual or multilingual. However, it's very important to understand it, to emphasize that this ideological shift that has provided a more positive status to Brazilian minority languages has not been translated into school policies. In fact, our Brazilian Common Core curriculum and even the very new proposal for guidelines for bilingual education didn't pay any attention to Brazil's linguistic diversity. So another important data, including our borders, is that around 500 cities are located directly on the border with other South American countries. So together we have around 10 million inhabitants, and this area is characterized by intense cross-border relations and by a scenario in which several languages coexist. But needless to say that the education policies in this context tend to be oriented by a monolingual ideology centered on the Portuguese language. So in addition, and it's very important to say that we've been watching an intense flow of immigrants from Bolivia, Haiti, Senegal, Angola, and Syria in the search of better life conditions, but Brazil has no official bilingual education policies for these migrants and refugees. So just to conclude my answer, despite all this linguistic diversity, we have been systematically watching the languages and cultures of the so-called minorities being silenced and made invisible in our country, as we've just observed in the proposal for guidelines for bilingual education. Sorry, I tried to be fast here.
Wonderful, Antonieta. Thank you for that. So most of us, when we refer to bilingual education, we automatically think of bilingual education or prestige languages, right? So we think Portuguese, English, that's bilingual education. So, Fernanda, why is it important for us to consider this diverse scenario of bilingual education in Brazil, also considering the minority groups, and how does that relate to our discussion also, and why have we decided to call this conversation towards a multilingual approach and intercultural approach?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Susan, Sphere, and all the group that created the possibility for this conversation. I'm very happy to be here with friends and people who think about bilingual, multilingual education in a critical way. I think that what Antonieta just said can present to us the demand for a different position towards what we understand by bilingual or multilingual education. In Brazil, we have a tendency to think that we are talking only or creating rules just for a few people. And that's exactly what we've been calling a necropolitic, or what I prefer to say, a necroeducation, an education that decides who has the right to study, to have education, and who doesn't. Mbembe talks about the way politics can create life or death, but language can also create life or death. And acceptance of these different communities and groups and contexts is essential for us to have a fair way of understanding by multilingual education. And that's the point from where I depart to make the distinction. First of all, it's very essential that we understand that when we are talking about bilingual or multilingual education, we are not talking about learning languages. This is another issue. We are talking about living a different type of education that has languages and ways of communicating and different resources as a means to create meaning together. We are talking about ways of expressing ourselves in a way that can create with the other a connection towards a better way of understanding and producing meaning together. Because of this concept, we have to understand that the idea of two languages, which is implicit in the idea of bilingual, has to be overcome by the idea that we have multiple resources, multiple modes to make meaning with the other. So we use our faces, we use our eyebrows, we use our nose, our mouth, our hands. I use my hands so much. We use our intonation. We use the combination of different words from different languages. We use everything we have in order to be together with the other. And teaching people, teaching students to use this is so very essential. So when we talk about this, we are not aiming at creating the best speaker of that language or the other language. And that's why thinking about exams as a way of deciding who can be a bilingual teacher or a bilingual student or a bilingual person in the world is not what we aim at. We aim at developing what Bloomert calls mobility, the possibility of participating effectively, empowered in an empowered way, in different contexts, being able to be heard, to make ideas come across to all people they want to. So this has to do with understanding context and learning the ways to participate in this context, both from the perspective of the way they use the language, but also on the perspective of how they use their feelings, their attitudes, their knowledge of the world, the knowledge of their interlocutors. And that's when, and I'm not going to talk about this to Ofelia here, but anyway, that's my idea of translanguaging. Translanguage has to do, first of all, as a means to make this connection possible. But what I think is more powerful and transformative in the concept of translanguage is not what some people say. So we're not going to teach students English or Spanish or Portuguese anymore. It's not important that they learn the best English or no, that's not it. We're talking about something that is very powerful, choice. Students cannot, or people cannot use one language or the other because they do not have the necessary resources to participate. They have to use whatever they want because they have them as part of their repertoire. So they make choices. And now I choose to speak Português e vou continuar em português. Now I choose to do with movement and do signs. Then I start to do Portunhol. This is my choice because I have a repertoire. I have the resources. So the schools which are called bilingual, they should be involved with creating possibilities for the students to develop resources. A very very vast amount of resources so that students can translanguage as a choice and not only as a means. So we need to think about some examples. And I will tell an example that I always give, but because I think it's so precise for these circumstances. Once we were at a conference with two students, one from a bilingual school, the other one from a very poor public school. And the one from the bilingual school had her poster, and it was in English. And the girl from the public school came to her, and she couldn't understand a word of what the other was saying. But this girl from the bilingual school kept presenting her text in English. And after a while, she asked her colleague, "Oh, would you like to ask any question?" And then the girl said, "Oh, I would like to say that you probably don't study at a public school because your English is so good." And then the girl from the bilingual school was, "Oh, you didn't understand?" And then I always ask, who had mobility in this situation? People immediately tend to think that it's the girl from the public school. And yes, she did not have mobility, because if she did, she would say, "Excuse me, I can't understand your English. Could you please say it in Portuguese or do something else that helps me understand?" But she's not the only one who can't understand. The other girl perhaps had a great proficiency in English, but she could not understand the context. She could not understand her interlocutor because she did not make connection and did not produce meaning together. So having mobility has nothing to do with learning two languages. It has to do with understanding the context, understanding the other, and using the resources that will make possible for you to create meaning together. Sorry, I'm very enthusiastic.
Well, that's wonderful, Fernanda. Thank you. And we love that you're very passionate and enthusiastic about these issues. It is true that people and schools in general have a tendency to think of either or. Either we work on developing proficiency and language skills and proper English and proper Portuguese, or we translanguage and it's laissez-faire, and you won't learn how to speak properly. And so this whole discussion of mobility and translanguaging is something that interests us very much, because we also understand that in order to have mobility, yes, we have to have the choice to use the resources that we have at the right moment and according to what the context demands. So I guess our question to Ofelia would be, how do you see this context that Antonieta set out for us, talking about our multilingual society, talking also about this movement that we have, that Fernanda is talking about in bilingual, in schools that work with prestige languages and that have a tendency to work with a monoglossic approach. How can we move towards a translanguaging approach?
First of all, Susan, obrigada. It's always a pleasure for me to be among my Brazilian friends, and especially to hear the passion of Fernanda, who's always passionate and teaches me so much, and the scholarship of Antonieta, that's also very enlightening to me. So thank you for letting me just be part of this dialogue. So, I want to just pick up on a lot of what Fernanda said, because I think the most important thing for all of us to understand who are in bilingual education, whatever that may be, and I want to first really reinforce the complexity that Fernanda brings to the fore, and the fact that the issue of bi and dual is just too limiting. And, I want to repeat that Antonieta started out by actually enumerating the differences in the people who have been involved in your linguistic diversity. Indigenous, immigrants, deaf communities, border people, and immigrants of different kinds, right? Having to do many times with race, which is, I think, in all of our colonial histories. It's something we don't speak about a lot, but I think that you as Latin Americans have taught me, anyway, a lot about coloniality and how racial hierarchies work. And I think that that's very important. I think that bilingual schools that teach, for example, English and Portuguese, the main task that they have is making sure that their students become critical about languages, and make sure that they understand this richness of language, and make sure that the teachers understand that bilingual education is not for language. Bilingual education, as my Frisian friend, long friend used to say, is not for language, it's for children, right? So how do you use this in a way that you educate children for a better society, for a society that is going to be more just, that is not just going to be about results in tests, or more inequality, failures and differences, but how are you going to do it in a way that it builds a just society? And I think that is the thread that goes across our very different education programs, whether they're government programs or elite programs. The education has to be critical, and that the students have to be made to think of their privilege and to think of the histories of colonization and global imperialism that have taken place. I think we all have to understand our place in society. So I just wanted to say that because that's where you brought me with what you all said. I think as far as translanguaging is concerned, I think that the big shift has been about thinking about languages not just as political, socio-political constructions, which they are, we have to acknowledge that they are, but that what we do with language is build, and I like to talk about it as an emergent network of meanings, right? We tend to think of languages as boxes, input and output, they're boxes. We talk about transfer, even as bilingual educators, transfer. We talk about additive, and that's a wrong metaphor. I mean, language is a network. It's a network of meanings, right? Because I'm always conscious of Latin American scholars, because I have to make an effort in order to reach all of you. Francisco Varela, who was a Chilean biologist, talks about the loopiness of the thing, the idea that it's all a network, right? The social, the political, the critical, the intellectual, the cognitive, the emotional, it's all a network, and we have to work with all of it. And I think all of us who are educators know how to do this, whether we call it translanguaging or we call it something else. But it's the idea that when you are confronted with a text, whether the text is in English, in Portuguese, or in, I don't know what, in Chinese, you bring yourself into it, right? And you bring all of that you have, all that network of meanings, your ethnography, your life, your experiences, your histories, your criticality, you bring that into the text. So in a way, if you engage with a text, even if it's a monolingual text, you are making it dynamically multilingual because you're bringing yourself into it. So I think that's what really has to be thought about. And it also has to be thought about can you distinguish about the product and the process? Sometimes when we are educating bilingually, we say, okay, the goal is we want to make them speakers and readers of French. Let's say French instead of English. And that is a product. Now, how you get to that product, though, is through a process which brings all of you into it, right? It's not you cannot be confined to just one language in order to do that. So I think that's the difference. The difference is also it's making people conscious of the fact that we don't have languages. We have this network of meanings that we're constantly leveraging. And I think teachers, once they understand that, I think teachers are comfortable with it because they know this is a way to make meaning. want to stop. So I want to give you a chance to tell me that I'm wrong.
Excellent. So, Ofelia, you mentioned also that education should be critical, and that while we use all our resources and we bring in who we are to make meaning in different languages, how can we connect? And I would like to forward this question to Antonieta. How can we connect the use of these different resources and our different languages also, but in the perspective of intercultural education?
So I will start by defining interculturality, because as it is a very polyphonic word, it has been used by many scholars in different ways and with diverse purposes. And of course, it all depends on your concept of interculturality. It's important to say that this word is even used in the Brazilian Common Core curriculum that proposes an intercultural dimension, and it was also used in this very recent proposal for guidelines for bilingual education. So I will briefly conceptualize interculturality based on what I understand to be a critical decolonizing view, and try to connect it with the way I understand our current scenario. So I will start by telling you a short and unfortunately we are now getting used to this kind of story in our country, and I guess many of you may already know it, that on June 2016, Paulo Freire's web page on Wikipedia, it was altered by somebody somehow related to this ultra-right movement. And among the alterations made were those, for example, that associated his pedagogy of liberation with Marxist indoctrination. I think everybody has already heard this story, yeah? So this movement intends to de-ideologize education, control curricula, and kept out of university and schools studies related to politics, gender, sexuality, feminism, Black, indigenous, any popular struggle or thoughts, and even African-based religions. So in the way I understand it, it means that any discussion about our own country and about who we are would be forbidden, because everything that they want to exclude means who we are as Brazilians, yeah? So interculturality in the scenario I've just described, for me, it's a pedagogy of re-existence. It's a response to this colonial and perverse ordering. So firstly, and really important to say, is that in this sense, interculturality is nothing related only to dialogue and interrelation among cultures, as the two documents that I've mentioned seem to conceive. A critical decolonizing view of interculturality calls for radical change in the dominant order and in its foundational base. So its proposition is to transform, reconceptualize, refound structures and institutions in ways to put in equitable relations, but of course it's still conflictive, diverse cultural logics, practices, and ways of knowing, thinking, acting, being, and living. So interculturality in this sense suggests a permanent and active process of negotiation and interrelation in which difference does not disappear. Otherwise, difference is central. So social-cultural, ancestral, politic, epistemic, linguistic differences are affirmed and understood as essential to the creation of new possibilities, comprehensions, coexistence, solidarities, and collaboration. So, as far as I understand it, an intercultural education is our chance to review and to recover our concealed histories, repressed subjective, subalternized knowledge systems, and silence languages. It means, for instance, that instead of being now discussing in national guidelines for bilingual education, which proficiency tests we are going to use to verify the level of English from teachers and students, we should be discussing, as the guidelines, as I've already said, also mention the word intercultural. We should be discussing how bilingual education can promote social justice for our country and value the so-called minorities. And as Boaventura de Souza e Santos calls, the epistemologies of the South. And now I'm going to say something related to one of his classes that I've just watched. And then he says that he just talks about very difficult words for me, epistemologies of the South, because there are the dominant epistemologies of the North. And that one day he expects that it won't make any sense to talk about epistemologies of the South, because this distinction will no longer exist. So based on this, I would like to answer my question saying that the same way I do expect that one day to define education as intercultural will also make no sense, because education will be, from a Freudian perspective, a way to reassert our own humanity, and then to talk about who we are and what constitutes us as a country. That's it.
Excellent. Fernanda, would you like to comment on what Antonieta has just said about intercultural education? And a lot of your work relates also to multiliteracies. So I don't know if you would like to comment on that.
Okay, thank you. I think that Antonieta said a lot that has to do with what I believe as well. I was also thinking about what Boaventura calls daltonismo cultural, cultural blindness, because many times we act at school as if there were only one truth that we should consider as that thing that we have to teach the students. We get this resource, we get this truth that we have to pass to the students in a very common and well-known concept of education that Paulo Freire used to call the banking education. But in an intercultural, critical multicultural perspective, we have to go beyond these barriers. We have to go beyond this fragmentation. We have to think about education in terms of, first of all, who is this guy here in front of me? Who is this student? What is the history that creates who he is or who she is? How was he constituted? What is the kind of group or groups that this person belongs to? How does this connect to the kind of culture and groups and lives that I live? How do our individual and collective lives interrelate in the classroom, creating space for us to think about the subjects that are essential for living the life that we live? And then the question of multiculturality or interculturality guides us to think about education in a way that opens the minds of the people to different perspectives. So, for example, if I'm going to teach any subject, where should I start? With what is in the book? With what is in the Common Core curriculum? Where should I start? In my opinion, we should start in the lives of the people and in the issues that are so essential to create new possibilities for being in the world. In this way, multiliteracies help us think about different ways, first of all, to do what Freire used to call to dive into reality, to understand, try to make sense of what we are living, and then emerge from reality, understanding that piece of reality we are in as part of a history are many histories that create that possibility. So sometimes people ask me, well, should we bring to class this idea of the earth being flat? Should we bring the discussion about chloroquine, as something that saves people from COVID? And then my answer is yes, of course. If it's something that is in the world, it has to be in the classroom. It has to be problematized in the classroom. It has to be discussed from different perspectives. Students should use their argumentative skills to build different possibilities of understanding those issues, to criticize, to evaluate, to create possibilities for living in a different way. Perhaps they will keep believing what they did before. Perhaps they will change. But at least, no matter what happens afterwards, they had the chance to expand what they thought, because they had different resources to rely on. They had different references. They had different perspectives of understanding the same. And this creates possibilities for us to expand not only the content that we are studying, but who we are and our choices on what we want to believe, how we want to act. That's very much connected to the idea that Boaventura brings of an ecology of knowledges. Because the moment I have contact with different ways of thinking about the same, I can expand and I can make different choices, or the same choices, more supported by how I understand the other perspective. So I do not become what the other wants me to, but I understand, I connect to the other, and I can improve, or I can expand at least who I am. So for me, participating in the classroom and teaching from a multicultural perspective has to do with diving into reality, emerging with different possibilities of understanding, criticizing this, and then creating possibilities for the students to intervene in reality so that they can understand the process they went through, not only as something that is for the school, but something that creates new possibilities of mobility and of living for each one of them.
Thank you, Fernanda. Ofelia, would you like to comment on what Fernanda has just said?
I'd like to comment on interculturality and multiculturality and all of this, because I think that there's something that Antonieta said in the beginning that we have to remember, which is that none of this has really been translated into language policy that really makes a difference. I really think that our work with teachers is essential. Teachers are the ones that have to create the spaces in which students become aware of these issues, in which students pick up this epistemic disobedience. We're not going to put up with this. We're going to be critical and think about it. And I love what Fernanda said about intervening in the reality. And I say this, Susan, because I know that your listeners today include a lot of teachers who are teaching in English, Portuguese, bilingual programs, maybe for the elite. And I always think that this message is most important for them. Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores in the United States have been doing a lot of work on what they call racial linguistic ideologies, the idea that it is the white listening subject that has to change, that the only difference that we will make in society through education is if we stop trying to change the speaker, who is always looked at as if they were inferior, and start thinking of how we change the white listening subject. And I really think that is where all of the teachers have an immense responsibility, because the negotiation and interrelation and connections that are essential for any type of interculturality cannot be built on distrust on inequality, on oppression, of subjugation, racialization. And so I think it can be done through education, but I think it has to be done from the ground up. Teachers have a huge responsibility to push, as we've always pushed.
Yes, absolutely. And I think now more than ever, this context that we're all facing now with this terrible pandemic also urges us to look for different ways of reconstructing what we do in schools from this multilingual perspective, from this intercultural perspective, because certainly we will be facing more inequalities, and we will need to face all of these challenges to be able to meet with this responsibility we have, especially in the more privileged context and communities, of being able to transform realities and to bring more equal opportunities to a greater number of people. It all seems very ideal, like, oh, okay, that sounds good, but how do we do this, And so, of course, we would have to maybe organize another session to talk about in practical terms, how do we do this? But I think a lot of what the three of you have said leads us to reflect on the importance of creating the possibility of more mobility in the multilingual environment, and also the dynamic use of languages and the critical approach to education and to interculturality. Because when we talk about international education, for example, it's all about international mindedness, right? That's another term. But what is international mindedness? And who are the people who are truly internationally minded, right? So that's an interesting discussion. We will have to now wrap up, and we have many compliments. We have many comments here that are just positive comments, thanking the three of you for this discussion. But we have a few questions, and so I will ask the first question. The first question is forwarded to Fernanda, and Fernanda, como vocês enxergam, so the question is in Portuguese, como vocês enxergam a expansão das escolas bilíngues no país, português e inglês, considerando que não há uma legislação nacional que regulamente essas escolas e que determine os requisitos a serem seguidos?
Well, this is a very nice question. I actually teach a course at Singularidades in which my students are invited to answer this question. And they do it after a long analysis of the context we live in, and also after they understand the limitations of laws such as this. In order to create such a law, it's essential that, first of all, people are heard. I think that to create what is the right and wrong or for a school cannot be decided by a national policy. It has to be created. It has to be discussed. It has to be constructed together, because we don't know the different realities that happen in Brazil in relation to the simple thing that we are talking about, that the question asks us about, which is English, Portuguese, prestigious education. Imagine when we think about the whole group of different scenarios that Antonieta talked about. So for us to create some rules for the country, which I don't know which they are, we need a lot of discussions. I have plenty of ideas that I believe are great, But I'm sure that Antonieta and so many other people have many different ideas of what would be best and what would not be good for their schools. So there must be some discussion, some analysis of this. We cannot just have something ruled from above without the participation of people. And one of the things that I believe is essential is we already have rules for teaching and learning in this country. We have to depart from those rules. We already have discussions about and laws about what is necessary in teacher education. We have to take these into consideration. For example, Antonieta mentioned that, and I did too. We already have rules for how and what kind of demands we will take from a teacher who wants to teach whatever they want to teach. So we cannot change this and now decide that what's going to decide who is going to be a teacher at a bilingual school is this or that exam. This is not important. If we are, in my opinion, we have, first of all, depart from what we have and then build with the community the needs and demands that the community has as a whole, not just for a small group of people, and not because some of the institutions want to make money out of these. We have to create possibilities for people to think about the country and think about what is necessary for the people and not for some groups of people. And that's normally what happens when we have a law. So many times in my course at Singularidades, my students end up by thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, it's better at this moment in the country not to have any rules, because some rules may be even worse than nothing.
Yeah, not an easy, not a simple solution. There's another question, and I'd like to ask Antonieta this question. So it seems that language awareness should be part of teacher education beyond letras, right? And so that teachers can learn how to work with this diversity. How can we do that?
A very difficult question. If I knew it, I don't know where I would be right now. I don't have the answer, but I think it's not only about language, yeah, and not only about language awareness. It's also and mainly about how to develop a cultural sensitive pedagogy. Yeah, it's about how it's about how can we connect to the other. Yeah, how as Fernanda has already said, it's about to learn how to have mobility. Yeah, and to value other ideas and to have access to other discourses. It's not only related to language, but I also don't know the answer. I think we are always trying to reinvent our teacher education here in Brazil and everywhere else, yeah, to face our new challenges as society. I don't know if Fernanda would like to add something, if you have a better answer.
No better answer. I just think that you're great and we are in tune. I think you're right. We have to have more conversations. We don't have something ready to answer these things. I would like to say something. We have a study group, and we have had this study group for more than 10 years. We've been dealing with this, and Susan, Antonieta, and so many others who are here participate in JEBI have been there for more than 10 years discussing these things. So I don't think there is something ready for us to do. Every time something appears in the scenario of this discussion, we take it to our group, just like today. Tonight, after this meeting, we are meeting to discuss going back to class, to face-to-face classes. Is this okay? So we are going to study the document we got. We are going to discuss this document, and then we will take decisions. That's what I suggest that all the people who are listening to us do as well. Every time you see a document, go over it and study and think about this in a group, not alone, because alone you just keep thinking about the same, but join other people, create a group, study together. That's the best solution for creating new ideas. So that's my suggestion.
That's wonderful. So really now I think that many of the questions that we've been receiving here are related to, we appreciate what you're saying, but how can we do this? How can we learn to work with this multilingual approach or within interculturality as we've been discussing here? So I would like to maybe we will have to discuss this in the future, but for now, I would like to ask you for a final word, maybe for our participants, thinking that we have created maybe this urge to think of what should we do now? You know, that we have all of these ideas and we've been inspired by you. So I think Fernanda has already expressed, you know, how she does it. Create groups, study together, think together. Would you have any other final thoughts for our viewers, Ofelia?
I think that we have to have principles, not rules, but principles. For example, in the work that I did with a large group, we could only agree on two principles. And that was that all the resources, linguistic resources of the children have to be used in instruction, and that the linguistic landscape around the classroom and the school have to be multilingual. Now, those are the two we could agree with on. And education has to be local. So I cannot tell you what to do. I cannot even tell you New York State what to do. I can only tell each school, you know, which direction they should move into. But there has to be principles. And the other thing is, teachers are always afraid to try things. I always use Martin Luther King's saying, you don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. And the first step for many schools was just, let's put up signs in the different languages. Now that is a very low step, but it's a step, and we have to start somewhere.
Thank you, Ofelia.
I wanted to say something about language awareness, if I can. And that is that the important thing with language awareness is to make sure that it's critical. So the big question for me always is, well, how was that language made? Because all of these languages, as Antonieta started with Portuguese, have been made. So what was the construction? When did it happen? Why did it happen? And why is it still being imposed? So I think that's the awareness that I would like everybody to have. Sorry.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Antonieta, would you have any final thoughts to share with us?
I think I have many thoughts, but I just would like to thank you for having invited me to be here and to say that for the first time in one live, because everybody knows I really like lives, I was a little bit nervous because of Ofelia. It's my first time with her, but I'm very honored, and I would like to thank you all. I couldn't hear you, Ofelia.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry? We couldn't hear you.
Obrigada. I learned a lot from the three of you. I really did.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here with you all.
Okay.
It's our pleasure. It's such an honor to have the three of you together. It's marvelous, and many people are asking for more. We will have to have more discussions in the future. So thank you once again, Ofelia, for your time, for joining us in this discussion. It's really amazing. Fernanda and Antonieta, thank you for your partnership and for sharing your precious ideas and views, and for your constant struggles, towards a more diverse, bilingual education, a more inclusive and multilingual and intercultural education, hoping that we all move in that direction. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our viewers. We hope to be with you in the future, taking this discussion further.
Thank you. Obrigada. Bye-bye.
Yeah.